Tafsir birai or tafsir based on one's own opinion is something that's quite common today. But as you say, it counts as a type of distortion of the Qur'an, just not the distortion in the actual text.
He was encouraging his companions, those who knew how to write it down. And there are different lists of scribes of the Quran in the historical books or the books of tafsir. If we have a hadith, if an infallible person says that, yes, we trust that. If another verses of Quran refers us to such meaning, we would accept that. If it was compatible with Aql Burhani, we would accept that. But without any supporting evidences or reason, we could not.
We cannot accept such interpretations, basically. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. And welcome again to another podcast with Faraj podcast. For today, the topic we have chosen is one that every few years I feel just keeps on coming back around, and this is the topic of distortion in the Qur'an. This is something that goes on around a lot, that every few years it's solved, and then a few years later we have a repetition of the same doubt, and again it comes to more information having to be gathered to answer this question again. So for this podcast, we have Zahra Farzanegan, who will be discussing the topic of distortion in the Qur'an, what types of distortion we have, and how this impacts a person's, I guess you can say, a person's spiritual life in going ahead towards Allah. And for that, we have Zahra Farzanegan, who is a teacher at Qom University and Jamiat Zahra, which is a very famous Hawza in Qom. And she has her PhD in Kalam. And for that, thank you very much for joining me.
It's a pleasure, thank you.
So, what is distortion of the Qur'an? In Arabic, it's called tahrif. But in English, obviously, we translate it as distortion. So, what does that really mean?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Tahrif or distortion, generally speaking, means to change the words of a text, to add some words to it, or to reduce some words from it. We Muslims, both Shia and Sunni, believe that Qur'an has no distortion, has no tahrif. Nothing have been added to the Qur'an, and nothing have been reduced from the Qur'an.
Although we have this, but a lot of the times you see, especially you've studied Kalam, right? You see that this happens quite a bit, that when one school of thought wants to attack another school, they will say, okay, you have tahrif in your hadith, therefore your hadith are wrong. And because, for example, as Shias, your Imam has these hadith on distortion have been attributed to the Imam. And I say attributed because they never, the Imams did not accept distortion at all. So they will say, okay, look, your Imam has a hadith on distortion, therefore your Imam is wrong, therefore your school of thought is wrong, and therefore you're kafir.
But you should ask us whether we accept those ahadith
or not,
whether we can trust those ahadith or not. Yes, of course we have some reasons to prove that the Quran has no distortion, and we have some evidences and reasons that shows that those ahadith are not trustworthy. So we start with the reasons for the absence of distortion in Quran.
The Quran.
One of the reasons that we use to prove that Quran has no distortion is the way the Quran was written down. So from the very beginning that Quran was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was encouraging his companions, those who knew how to write it down. And there are different lists of scribes of the Quran in the historical books or the books of tafsir. So for example, in this hadith, we have different names. We have the name of Imam Ali alayhi salam. We have the names of other companions of the Prophet like Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, Zayd ibn Sabit, Ubay ibn Ka'b, Ma'udh ibn Jabal, and many others. So from the very beginning, the Quran was written down. And when something is written down, then the chance for the distortion of that text would be reduced a lot. And that's different from what happened to the previous heavenly books. Because for example, Torah or Injil, there was a gap between the time that they were revealed to the prophets and the time that people tried to write it down and record it. And that gap is a good excuse for those who wanted to do distortion to those texts, actually. But we don't have such problem for the writing of Quran. And even when at the time of the demise of the Prophet Muhammad, Quran was already gathered together. All the verses and the chapters were written by Imam Ali alayhi salam and also others.
And we have that in history as well, where Imam Ali alayhi salam went with the Quran and he presented it, but obviously certain people refused to accept it.
Yes.
And those who assume that the Quran of Imam Ali was different from the Quran that was revealed to the Prophet, they say the Quran was bigger, right? I mean, the volume, it was more voluminous, basically. So therefore, they assume that the Quran of Imam Ali was different, but that's not true, is it?
No, because Imam Ali never said, look, my Quran is different and it's better, so take it. Or he didn't refuse to accept the Quran that was commonly used among the people. The difference that it had was about the sequence of the chapters, because it was written by Imam alayhi salam in accordance with the sequence of the revelation, and also it had some interpretations based next to some of the verses, and that's why the volumes were actually more.
And the Prophet has said, "Ana madinatul ilm wa Aliyun babuha."
Yes.
So so Imam Ali alayhi salam had an interpretation according to the way the Prophet interpreted the Quran. So it was the Qur'anic interpretation from the one on whom the Quran was revealed.
Yes. And also, beside writing the Quran, there were so many people who were trying to memorize the Quran.
Yes.
So Quran was not like a book or some speeches that was revealed to a person and it was hidden by him and no one else was aware of that. It was a commonly used, actually, a speech among the people. So the chance for the distortion would be reduced a lot.
Would be reduced as well. This brings another point, actually. You know, obviously in Usul we study the Hujjiyat al-Zawahir al-Quran, and in it, when we're discussing the evidences, now one of those evidences actually applies here, is that the Imams used to give the proof of a ahkam based on the Quran. Therefore, if the Quran is so ingrained within a society, it is impossible for it to get distorted so quickly. It would require a lot of, I guess it would require a lot of corruption to take place in society, which the Ashab never allowed it to happen.
Yes, and actually this is a very famous incident. Ibn Abil Hadid has mentioned this story in his commentary on Nahj al-Balagha, that once Muawiyah tried to remove one vav, the letter vav, yes, vav, from one of the verses of Quran. Of course, reducing and omitting that vav would change a lot to the meaning of the verse, and he was going to do it on purpose. When Ubay ibn Ka'b, one of those scribes of the Quran, heard about the decision of Muawiyah, he took his sword and said, I would never put down my sword until I return that vav into its place.
So if you even change the one vav in the Quran, I'm going to start killing someone.
Yes, they wouldn't let that.
They wouldn't let that. Excellent.
Some other stories are also mentioned. Our audience can refer to Tafsir of Tabari, volume 11, and page 7 to refer to other stories like that.
Just to kind of, as a side note, Tafsir Tabari has a few, some of the volumes of Tafsir Tabari have been translated into English. So for our viewers who are not familiar with the Arabic or the Farsi language, can easily refer to Tafsir Tabari, English translations of it. Obviously the volume would now differ, But yeah, you can check this out.
Yes. So there were so many people who had written down the Quran. They kept it at their home. They were reciting that in their prayers, daily prayers, and different occasions. They were reciting that in front of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam to make sure they have written correctly and they have memorized correctly. Also, the names of some of the wives of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam have been mentioned as the memorizers of Quran. It was a common behavior and attitude towards Quran.
It was also something they were very proud to do. I mean, because of so many of the hadith encourage memorizing the Quran, it was something that was seen as something that is, I guess, something that gives a person more value to memorize the Quran based on the hadith that they have. And I think today as well, we still have the same notion that one who's memorized the Quran, they are very much respected members of society.
Yes, of course. And one of the incidences that has been recorded in the historical books shows that how it was common among the people to memorize Quran and how many memorizers of the Quran were living at that time. So for example, after the demise of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, one battle was occurred between the Muslims and the person who had a false claim of prophethood. And it has been written that at least 70 people of those memorizers of the Quran and those who were writing the Quran have been killed, have become martyred in that field.
So basically, there were so many people who memorized the Quran that just in one battle you had many memorizers of the Quran. That even if they were killed, 70 is just a small number I mean, not 70 is a small number of people who were martyred. I mean, 70 is just small compared to the number of memorizers of the Quran who existed at the time.
Yes. So when we see the environment, the Islamic society, their culture, the way they were behaving in Quran, the possibility of distortion of the Quran would be so much reduced. Beside all these, Quran itself talks about the lack of chance or the absence of the chance for distortion in the Quran. For example, we have this verse, إِنَّا نَحْنُ نَزَّلْنَا الذِّكْرَ وَإِنَّا لَهُ لَحَافِظُونَ. With so much emphasis, Allah says that we have revealed this Quran and we are definitely the protector of it.
So the emphasis here is inna.
Inna.
نحن نزلنا عليك الذكر. Inna again. Inna.
Lahu.
The lam of the lahu. لحافظون. The lam of the.
Yes. You know, in Arabic we say khabar. Lahu is khabar. Hafizun is ism inna. So lahu is before hafizun. So the chain, the sequence of different organs of the sentence have been changed, and it shows the emphasis. Also, there is one lam, the letter lam at the beginning of hafizun. It's another emphasis. So the Quran testifies that it was not subject, or it cannot be subject to any distortion. So for example, we have a verse in Quran, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم, إِنَّا نَحْنُ نَزَّلْنَا الذِّكْرَ وَإِنَّا لَهُ لَحَافِظُونَ. إِنَّا لَهُ لَحَافِظُونَ means definitely we are the protectors of Quran. إِنَّا نَحْنُ نَزَّلْنَا الذِّكْرَ, we have revealed the Quran. Dhikr is one of the names for the Quran. وَإِنَّا لَهُ لَحَافِظُونَ, and definitely we are the protectors of Quran. So how is it possible that Allah is the protector of something and still some part of it is missing, and we are accused to believe that 1/3 of Quran is missing? So how is it possible?
Yes, definitely.
So there is common agreement among our ulamas and our even ordinary people that the Quran that we are reciting today is the same Quran that was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It was the same at the time of Ahlulbayt alayhimus salam as well. They themselves were asking people to refer to the same Quran that was available for them.
And interestingly, for those who've ever been to Iran, in Mashhad we have a museum in the Haram of Imam Rida alayhi salam itself. We have a museum where the Qur'an as written by the Imams is kept in its proper, in its actual writing, and it's all on display for people who want to see. And this in itself bears testament to the fact that the Ahlulbayt wrote the same Qur'an that we had today. So it's not like we have a different Qur'an to other schools of thought. We have the same Qur'an that everyone reads, and we read the same Qur'an as well. Perfect.
And now we have some ahadith which talks about the distortion in Qur'an. First of all, many of them, the chain of translator is not correct.
Chain of transmission.
The chain of transmission, yes. So either there is no reliable narrator for them, or many of them are actually narrated by one person. So it shows that
one person has written all those hadith and come up with a
yes
fabrication.
And if we pay attention to the others, also to the other ahadith, many of them are not going to convey the meaning that the Qur'an was distorted. They are actually adding some words to some specific verses as their interpretation.
So just for our viewers, basically, who may not be very familiar with the way hadith are sometimes written, a narrator of a hadith may quote a verse of the Qur'an, then in parentheses they would put the interpretation, but sometimes when these hadith were transmitted, those parentheses were lost, and then it was just attached to the verse, and then as time got along, they kind of end up thinking that the interpretation is part of the verse, when it's not so.
Yes. And some other ahadith are talking about the fact that people have distorted Qur'an because they have misinterpreted.
That brings us to tafsir bil-Rai.
Yes.
Basically,
that's another kind of distortion that we can go through.
Yeah, that is a very important one, actually. And I'm glad you raised this point, because tafsir bil-Rai, or tafsir based on one's own opinion, is something that's quite common today. But as you say, it counts as a type of distortion of the Qur'an, just not the distortion in the actual text.
Yes. And this is something that has been prohibited by Ahlulbayt alayhim salam. And there is a hadith Qudsi which says, "Ma amana bi man fassara bi ra'yihi kalami." The person who interprets my words based on their personal opinion is not believing in me, doesn't believe in me. It means that the true belief and the honest belief in God should stop the person from such behavior and attitude towards Quran.
Interestingly, there's also hadith from the Prophet, and this is quoted in Ayatollah Subhani's book. Now, for the viewers who are actually interested in reading a bit more into the science of tafsir al-Quran and tahrif and all of these issues, there's a very interesting book, Introduction to the Science of Tafsir of the Quran, by Ayatollah Ja'far Subhani, which has been translated into English and is very easily available online as well. And from there he brings a hadith, and he says, whosoever interprets the Quran according to his own opinion must take for himself a place in the fire in the hellfire, which is a hadith from the Prophet.
Yes, and this is a famous hadith, of course.
Which kind of shows how for lack of better words, how bad such an act is deemed within Islam.
Yes.
Anyone who tries to interpret the Quran based on their own opinions should be ready to find themselves going towards hell.
Yes. And how it can happen if a person already has an idea, an opinion or belief, and is looking for some verses to actually prove that their idea is correct, without considering whether that verse is actually supporting their idea or not. And they are actually imposing their own ideas on the Quran, that they are not learning from Quran, they are going to teach Quran, of course. And this is haram, this is prohibited, this is a kind of distortion that we can admit it has happened to Quran, of course.
It's basically taking their preconceived notions, finding a verse from the Quran and saying, oh look, whatever opinion I had is correct.
Yes, without having any supporting evidences or
so
clear
when
reasons.
we're looking at evidence, we mean from the Sunnah and
from Qur'an or Aql. The
Qur'an,
three sources that we mentioned in the
okay, the
previous
Qur'an,
episode.
the Sunnah, and the Aql.
Yes.
Am I correct? Okay, perfect.
So, for example, we have this verse in Quran, وَأَنَّ الْمَسَاجِدَ لِلَّهِ فَلَا تَدْعُوا مَعَ اللَّهِ أَحَدًا. It means the places of worship belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so you should not worship anyone besides Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is a verse that Wahhabi people are actually using to say that tawassul, the attitude that Shia people have, is haram and prohibited.
So they use this verse to say tawassul is not allowed.
Yes.
Oh, wow.
Because it says فَلَا تَدْعُوا مَعَ اللَّهِ أَحَدًا.
فَلَا تَدْعُوا مَعَهُ. But tawassul is not obeying
مع
some.
الله. You know, the meaning of ma'iyya.
Ma'iyya,
We have to pay attention to the meaning of ma'iyya. Ma'iyya here doesn't mean that you shouldn't ask help from anyone other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It means that you consider the person that you are requesting at the same level of Allah.
But we don't do that in tawassul.
Yes, of course we don't do that.
But then interesting, there's another verse as well. وَابْتَغُوا إِلَيْهِ الْوَسِيلَةِ.
Yes.
So it's over here, they've taken one verse and separated the other. They've
Yes.
not.
Yes, like what has happened in the history of Islam previously. Khawarij also, when they were fighting, Imam Ali alayhi salam said, La hukma illa lillah. And they were actually accusing him for accepting hakamiyya as something that could be described as a gunah or a crime. And if we just pay attention to one verse and we disregard the other verses of the Quran, it is a kind of, it would lead to tafsir bil-ray, of course.
Very interesting.
And also we were talking about tawassul. We have this verse in Surah Yusuf, when the sons of Ya'qub were going to repent to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they came to their father and said, Ya abana astaghfir lana dhunubana. They asked their father, Prophet Ya'qub, to ask forgiveness for them before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he didn't say, no, this is wrong, you have to go straight
And
to Allah
he's a
subhanahu wa
prophet
ta'ala.
of Allah as well.
He accepted. He said, Sawfa astaghfiru lakum rabbi. Yes. So it means this is something allowed. And it's something actually recommended. And if we even refer to our own intellect, if we have some requests from a very high status person, for example, in the society, we know some other people who are closer to him, and if we ask them to go to that person, their request would be answered more quickly. So we would do that. This is something rational, of course.
Definitely.
Or another verse, or we can say another example for tafsir bil-ray is the tafsir that some of the urafa or mystics had. And some of them, of course, tried to interpret the Quran based on their mystical views.
And over here we have we stress on the word some of
Yes,
the
some
tafash,
of them,
not
of
all
course.
of them. So
Yes. So, for example, we have this verse in Quran, وَسَقَاهُمْ رَبُّهُمْ شَرَابًا طَهُورًا. This is Allah is describing one of the blessings that happens in the heaven.
one of the blessings of
Yes.
heaven.
وَسَقَاهُمْ رَبُّهُمْ شَرَابًا طَهُورًا. Sharaban here means a drink, a pure drink. Allah is going to give such pure drink to His special servants in the heaven. Ibn Arabi, for example, one of the ulafa, in his tafsir book, mentions that sharab here doesn't mean real drink. It means the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But without any supporting evidences, it doesn't seem bad, to interpret sharab as the love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which purifies the soul of those servants. But without any supporting and clear evidences from either Qur'an or Ahadith or Aql Burhani, as Ayatollah Jawadi mentions, we cannot say that. This is a kind of tafsir bil-ray.
We just have to tread a bit more carefully when it
Yes.
comes to
Yes.
these sort of verses and these sort of interpretations. Ibn Arabi is a very celebrated mystic, I guess.
Yes.
And I guess we wouldn't be able to say all his work is wrong. But if we're looking at his work, sometimes, as it is with every other work, we need to tread a bit more carefully. And also, I guess, refer a bit more to the Hadith as well on these issues.
Yes. Or for example, we have this verse, فَلَمَّا أَتَاهَا, it's about Prophet Musa. فَلَمَّا أَتَاهَا نُودِيَ مِنْ شَاطِئِ الْوَادِ الْأَيْمَنِ فِي الْبُقْعَةِ الْمُبَارَكَةِ مِنَ الشَّجَرَةِ أَنْ يَا مُوسَى إِنِّي أَنَا اللَّهُ رَبُّ الْعَالَمِينَ. So according to the apparent meaning of the verse, Prophet Musa heard a voice out of a shajara, a tree.
A tree, yes.
Yes. And some of the mystics say that, the voice actually was an inner voice that Musa heard it from his,
From his own self.
Yes, from his own self.
Oh,
But
okay.
it's not compatible even with the apparent
Yeah.
aspect of the verse.
Yeah.
And if we have a hadith, if an infallible person says that, yes, we trust that. If another verses of Qur'an refers us to such meaning, we would accept that. If it was compatible with Aql Burhani, we would accept that. But without any supporting evidences or reason, we could not.
We cannot accept
Yes.
such interpretations,
Yes.
basically.
And nowadays, unfortunately, this method of approach towards Qur'an have been common under the title of hermeneutics.
So this is a new approach that's now developing, I guess, a lot more today.
Yes. So generally speaking, when it comes to the interpretation of Qur'an, we have to be very careful. We have to go step by step. There are several sciences and knowledge we have to gain. We have to study them so that inshallah we can understand more from Qur'an and we can actually benefit more and more from Qur'an.
And get
inshallah.
the real nur of the Quran as well.
Inshallah, yes.
And with that, we conclude our podcast for today. Thank you so much for joining us in another session with Faraj podcast. And if you like our podcast, and we would really appreciate it if you can subscribe to our channel, hit the bell notification so you're always notified when we have a video out. And we hope to see you again on another session with Faraj podcast. Thank you very much.